Hello. Hello, very beautiful community. Hello, very beautiful community. Let me know if you can see and hear me. Meanwhile, my thought is, I don't know what my thought is. We do a kind of personal Q&A on Sunday, and I just thought to throw out there as a topic the fact that the personal and the political blends for us in a way that's often difficult. I think sociologically, let me just check that you're hearing me. I think sociologically, there are two things um, which are happening to us. One is that our blueprint of what politics should be is not matching reality. And now, there are a few freaks in our society who are both, if you like, liberal democratic minded and think that what's happening is a version of normal. I'm one of these freaks. But that's really because ever since my teenage period, I have been almost for professional reasons normalizing for myself the idea of human beings living under radically different social conditions with very different social imaginaries. But I think for a lot of people in our liberal democratic predicament, in the loosest sense, there is a gap between blueprint and reality. And that can be very difficult to square because it gives you the feeling that reality is not just going badly, but it doesn't make sense. And then I think another thing that's a big feature of our culture is something that's connected with what we've just said, but also separate. And that's that we are quite saggy by historical standards in the way the personal and the political works for us. The personal sags into the political very much for us, and the political sags into the personal. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't be personal when we're being political, or that we can't be political when we're being personal. All of that's true. Um, 20th century feminism showed all kinds of ways in which the personal is the political. And, you know, writers about politics from Aristotle and indeed earlier showed that political activity is one of the natural activities of human beings, that politics, um, like so much else that we do, is one of the default human activities without which you couldn't imagine any collective human life. But despite that, the way the two interact for us is a bit sort of leaky gut like. Sorry for those of you with no chronic illness experience who don't understand what that means. But there's something unhealthy. There's a kind of a seepage going on for us in our culture. And that's something that affects all of us. Even though, of course, um, as always with a cultural tendency, some of us are more picked up by it than others. So these are my first introductory thoughts. Obviously, because we are talking about weird stuff again, we're going to be a small room. So hopefully that'll mean we'll get to more questions. Robert. Hi, Vlad. Hi, Robert. There's a general rise of youth-led protests around the world. I'm curious what lessons you think the beautiful community should learn from these. Well, I think the youth protests get a lot of bashing. Somebody like Greta gets a lot of bashing. But I am slow to bash young people who are trying to do something, even if they're doing something that's a bit off, or even if they're doing something that they think is one thing, but I think is another. Very often, of course, youthful activism is as much about expressive politics as it is about effective politics. I suppose what we can learn from it is that certain debates that we might think are settled might not actually be settled, that we can actually be realistically more open-minded about many issues than we're being, including about our sense of what's possible. I think what we can also take from it is that every generation makes sense of its world for itself and finds its own uh, sense of hope and purpose, no matter how easy or difficult the historical environment is. And what we can also learn is that intergenerational dialogue is very important. Younger generations can push us very nicely, but we can also make a few wise observations, for instance, about one thing that I always say, which is that you're not going to get any effective political progress unless you push it through the already available institutions. These institutions need radical reform. They need to be reformed with a reform project, probably backed by a social project of civic renewal. What that reform project looks like is different in different countries. But despite that, smashing our institutions ain't going to be useful. So we can say that back to the younger generation, and they can say, "Hey, you're complacent, you're blind, you're out of touch, you're not seeing how certain things that seemingly are contradictions and irreconcilable things can be actually pulled together and done at the same time, and so on." So you see, my answer is procedural. Intergenerational dialogue is incredibly important, and plugging in young people into our political conversation is incredibly important. To what extent are you morally culpable if you end up working for a bureaucracy that's increasingly undemocratic? So, this is the old boiled frog question. You've got to jump off in time, but understand that usually what this means is that you've got to jump off when an institution you're in is simply servicing an authoritarian regime. But this can be very difficult. I mean, imagine um, working in Russia. I'm giving you an actual example, but I'm going to fictionalize it. Um, Imagine working in Russia up until the start of the full scale invasion of Ukraine with a project that helps children with cancer. But to run the project, you need to have dealings with the Putin regime. If you didn't have dealings with the Putin regime, you wouldn't run the project. You'd just be sitting on your bum at home. So what do? At what point do you stop compromising? Um, these are always difficult personal decisions. In a Western democracy, a very good litmus test is this: is there significant pluralistic political competition? If there still is, you keep going. Typically, if all competition has been asphyxiated, and a particular government department is a department for the glorification of the great leader, well, then you jump, right? So that's the first thing. Watch out for how much pluralism there still is in the system. The second thing is that psychologically, you're typically going to be um, uh, able to persuade yourself in a delusory way that it's worth staying longer than it is worth staying. I'm not saying that's remotely the case now in any Western country, but tendentiously human beings overstay because they normalize what they're doing. They say, well, yes, but if I weren't here, somebody worse would be here, and blah blah blah. Well, if that's true, then you'd better make sure that's true. Look at Miss Nebiulina, right, running the Russian economy. Now, she thinks the war is a disaster, but she's stumm about it because she wants to bring it about that at least the Russian people don't become too impoverished during the war. The problem is how making the Russian economy more effective helps Putin's war machine. So, difficult dilemmas in the West. You look out for pluralism and you look out for our psychological knack of saying, nah, I'm still doing the right thing, even when you're not. Because what happens is that when we drift a millimeter a fortnight, we don't notice that we've actually moved a whole meter over the course of a prolonged period of time. David, I'm not sure what question you're asking about normies being asleep at the wheel, but I think in many ways we're all asleep at the wheel, and there are different ways of being asleep at the wheel. Being asleep at the wheel through not paying attention to politics is one way. Another way is of being in a blinded way involved in politics. Even being hyperactively involved in politics can be one way of being asleep. Toby, is there a particular vulnerability to having a written constitution, um, to having a parliament rather than a written constitution that's sovereign? Um, these questions were interesting in the 90s. They're not interesting in the same way today. Um, if you've got a decline in trust, you're going to need a project of reform and civic renewal. It don't matter what the state of your democracy is when it comes to whether you've got a constitution or not. Um, this is small fish, really. You're going to be roughly equally as deep in trouble if things go bad, you know, no matter whether your country's got a constitution or not. Constitution is something that can be a source of divisiveness, conflict, toxicity, wildly differing and untruthful interpretation, and so on. Really frustrated by the low quality debate, Echelon says, in election season. Why can I only choose between sleepwalking technocrats, theatrical activists, or aspiring autocrats? Not a bad question. What I would say is that when we talk about elections, we have a very emaciated, what some leftist critics would call neoliberal conception of what an election is. I don't think of an election as just what happens when you and I press a few buttons online or when you and I go to the polling booth. An election is what happens when everything that's of pertinence to the choice that's being made is at hand. So, public discourse a year ahead in the run up to the election is part of the election. And an election is less democratic if that discourse is of low quality because of the way it has to be organized in the media environment. So, it's not just that we become less democratic when we asphyxiate the way the electoral system works and exclude some people from it or tendentiously exclude them. It's that we become less democratic when the process of the run up to the election is less rich and less discursively substantive. Both are democracy deficits. Can society tell ID poll? Is that identity politics? Can society tell identity politics people, I hear you, I understand the harm that I cause you, I won't radically change, but I will do my best? It depends on what you mean by identity politics. There's a very healthy type of identity politics that we can't live without. Um, we all have a kind of inseparability between certain forms of group belonging that we experience, multifaceted kinds of group belonging, um, and on the other hand, the particular picture of the good life politically that we entertain. Um, you don't want to smash that. You don't want to attack that. You don't want to replace that by some kind of bogus, tyrannical rationality of politics beyond identity. You're going to just take human life out of politics that way. But when it comes to people who practice hyper identity politics, people who really, really moralize political disagreement, who make political disagreement not just moral, but about identity, who then demand institutions to attend to that identity and embody it, To these people, you say, I love you. Um, we share a society. I stand by your rights. I stand by the equality of your political claims vis-a-vis mine, but you're misbehaving. I'm not going to indulge this bullshit at all. I'm not going to indulge this nonsense. So, um, with hyper identity politics, it's a flat no, I'm afraid. Um, but with general identity politics, it's the modern world. Politics is infused with identity politics. I'm going to do a workshop, Blue Flower, on how to negotiate the social media environment for people like you, for people like us. It's purely because of health that I am um, slow to do certain things, but I think we need that, and I'm going to make one available. Daniel Kaminsky says, I make, from my point of view, ugly statements about some of my conservative leaning co-workers. Generally, I'm receptive to most kind of people, but I find this part of my life difficult to navigate. Yes. Um, Understand that their conservatism and your liberalism or your leftism or your greenness or your whatever you are, your anarchism, um, are in equal measure responses to the different pulls and pushes in our culture that act on all of us, but to which you and your conservative colleagues respond differently. Understand the deep psychological and cultural ways in which you're in the same boat and doing your best. Micro-based studio, US hyper-identity politics, very nasty people on both sides. That's not what I mean by hyper-identity politics. I associate hyper-identity politics with, um, let's say, a form of corrupted, hyperactive liberalism. I don't associate hyper-identity politics with the right. Um, on the right, you have an ugly, on the X right now, you have an ugly, old fashioned kind of exclusionary identity politics, which isn't hyper identity politics. It's a different enterprise. It's not emanating out of a corruption of liberal values. It's good old authoritarian exclusionary politics. And therefore, I think it's different. I don't think Trumpists practice hyper identity politics. Micro-based studio, it looks like it's your birthday. It looks like you're 42 years young. Happy birthday and congratulations. I hope you can do something special to celebrate. Long-time follower from Toronto. I rarely comment. Let me shoot my question. Okay. I can't see your question. You're going to shoot it below. Um, I haven't. There we go. I think I see it. Aaron, 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 Aaron. Question. Never meet your heroes is a phrase that implies you'll always be disappointed by the imperfections of those you admire. To avoid this, how do I form a better relationship with my heroes? I completely disagree. It's one of the most beautiful things to reach out to your heroes, even if they don't reply. Um, but what you want is to have the heroes as a healthy ego ideal, not to have them, not to internalize them as a kind of object that has very little resemblance to what they are actually like. So don't idealize them in the negative sense, but do idealize them in the positive sense. I am, for instance, I don't mean to sound arrogant about this. I am very generous with my heroes. There's a lot of heroes I have who are, for me, in all kinds of ways, imperfect, but there's certain things that are very, very beautiful about them, and so they remain my heroes. Um, so I think that it's largely false to think you shouldn't meet your heroes, because actually, um, if they really should be your heroes, it's going to be very good to meet them. It's going to be very good to interact them. If it's bad to interact them, then they're not really your hero. They might just be somebody who you enormously appreciate in a particular domain. Um, can I contradict myself and pull back on something I say? Yeah, I suppose a pushback would be, well, Vlad, think about, I don't know, Beethoven, an erratic and somewhat scary character who you would be sort of uncannily alarmed by if you met in person. Beethoven would be strange and deeply strange. But um, Beethoven is my hero because Beethoven, the composer, is my hero. Beethoven, who behaves in a strange way and is erratic or sort of rips off wallpaper off the wall or throws about dinner plates, that's not my hero. That's a poorly regulated man who also is a musical genius. So, some thoughts for you. JVC says, JVCV and V says, I went to the No Kings protest and felt a modicum of hope. But I'm quickly back to the feeling that the coming years of the MAGA Trump horrors will be unbearable. They'll be bearable. They'll be shit, but they'll be bearable. Um, but you need to make sure that if you're somebody for whom it's more bearable, that you watch out for folks for whom it's less bearable, either psychologically or practically. Beneath the fear, Dolores asks, and anger, do I deal with the nagging doubt that maybe I really am inferior and deserve to be second class? I wouldn't feel so angry if it didn't sting. I would need to know quite a lot more about you to understand where that comes from. I mean, one thing I would say is that a lot of people really struggle. Like most people are struggling with themselves, with who they are, with a sense of self esteem, with being lost. Um, most people are struggling. Most people are screwed up to some degree. And that includes people in important positions of power. So that's just sociologically true. But I would want to know more before I can tell you about where that's coming from, right? I mean, it might be to do with a certain kind of um, social history. You've got some kind of class history. It might be to do with childhood issues, stuff that happened to you when you were little, childhood trauma. For goodness sake, it might be to do with being neurodiverse. Um, and finding self-questioning difficult. So I'm always in our culture a very big fan of therapy, but with the caveat that our need for therapists is greater than the quality of the quantity of quality therapists that our society can realistically provide. Um, but certainly, the fact that you ask the question means you're not just thinking about it, you're also able to extract this out of yourself, talk about it with people you care about, hopefully. So that matters. That matters too, connecting around this challenge if you're not going to do therapy with your close friends. It would be unethical to say more unless you gave me like 2 or 3 paragraphs. Vukasin Josic, I think I'm becoming black pilled. about my politics and my country, Serbia, in the sense that I don't care what's going to happen. I used to be very political, I still am, but about other countries. Look, I think that sometimes it's important to not ask of yourself to do or give things you can't ask or give. There is no point at all, you know, putting yourself on the running track if you know you're just not in the mood to run. Um, so I think that get curious about where this is coming from, explore it, but don't force yourself and remain gentle on the part of you that might not want to be gentle to you about this. It might want to push you back into doing something constructive or following things constructively. Don't forget, also, just keeping your sanity is an important element of, where we are. Philip, is it not an unequivocal salient fact that our culture has lost the transcendental grounding of morality and that we have yet to find a robustly viable non-transcendental one? Well, one thing to say about that is that in a certain sense, um, a transcendental grounding of morality was always something with flaws, always something you could pick at, always something that perhaps failed to give you the healthiest resources out of which to construct a kind of an ethical wherewithal. So you might actually say that some of what we've lost was not good when we had it either. But clearly, what we have largely lost is teleology. We've lost the sense that the world is gradually converging on some kind of species wide civilization that might express itself not just politically and economically, as in Fukuyama, but also ethically. But I think more deeply, we've lost a cosmic point of view. There is no such thing as being good or bad from a cosmic point of view, really, really. Certainly not in the Western world. Notice that's different to the question of whether we've become less religious. I'm not saying we've become less religious. I'm saying that our religious people have become more secular and work out much of their ethical life in a way that is more, as the great philosopher Chuck Taylor would say, more imminent um, than in the past. That's to say, you might have a relationship with God, but you're not going to work out what tax policy should be in terms of your relationship with God, and you're not going to work out, how to treat your friends and colleagues in terms of your relationship with God, or what your responsibilities as a parent are. Now, you see, I'm clearly saying things that would still be um, uh, absolutely conceived in terms of people's relationship with God and our culture, but this is a matter of degree, right? The degree to which a person who has a relationship with God can have an ethical relationship about what it means to be a parent that bypasses their relationship with God, that is unprecedentedly, exponentially higher in our culture. Greta was cool as long as she stuck to climate. She went to more extreme protest and is now literally making propaganda for um, terror orgs. Yeah, no, she's not doing that. You could question what the political efficacy of Greta is joining the flotilla, but Greta is not doing that. The most important thing to tell you is this. Let me just do this very quickly. Typing with one hand. Greta, there we go. I'm looking for her age. 22. 3rd of January 2003. Assess Greta when she is 60. Um, Give her the opportunity to explore, give her the opportunity to grow. I mean, there is a politically strong argument which says, look, she'd have been most effective if she stuck to climate. Um, but you know, if your grandma were a bicycle, she wouldn't be your grandma. I mean, what can you say? So give this young person the possibility to explore, to develop herself, to develop her sense of contribution. The correct attitude by adults to Greta is to be protective, not to be dismissive and derisive, even if you think she's doing something unproductive. Um, you know, um, it might just be that she can't do climate. Um, it just could mean that anything she perceives is a wrong has to be acted upon by her. Uh, so she might not really have that choice without stopping being who she is. But give the kid a chance to get to 40 and 50, and then talk about how she's judged her career. Um, uh, Thomas, Vlad, you talked about citizens' assemblies. How would it work? Would they be institutionalized? How citizen assemblies would work would be different in each country. Um, there's a literature on citizens assemblies. There's a track record of citizens assemblies in various countries. There's one mode of activism that often talks about citizens assemblies. That's climate activism. But the parameters with which you need to work is that they've got to make the people feel who are in them that they are part of the political process and they're not just in a sort of glorified talking shop for disillusioned citizens. On the one hand, on the other hand, you've got to understand that there's also democratic pressure to not dismantle central democratic institutions, so that citizens' assemblies should be thought of as a supplementary matter, right? Not a substitution for the institutions we've got. Relative time works, things seem surreal. Things have become too blindly loyal with no factional self-reflection, very hard to solve. Really hard to solve because we're not just in different mental bubbles, we're in different fact bubbles. Um, and that's getting worse. We're progressively diverging, progressively less able to share in a joint fact world. Things are surreal when mm, people are saying one thing, but their behavior doesn't reflect it. That's always going to be surreal. And so the number of charlatans in our politics is going to make things seem surreal inevitably. But things also seem surreal because things are going against our blueprint. There's a mismatch between our blueprint and what the political world looks like. That's mostly true for most people in this small room. So um, it's inevitable. I think that eventually that'll realign the blueprint mismatch, but we need more time processing. We haven't even begun to process what's going on. Adam Ragusia, hi, beautiful Adam. Can you say more about the line between political and moral disagreements? Surely some political disagreements are also moral. Yes. Um, there is a tendency in the West to think about politics in two ways, to think about politics normatively in two ways. One way says politics is the application of moral principles, if that's how you conceive of morality. Again, there are two traditions in the West about that too. One conceives of morality as a set of principles, another conceives of morality as really something that emanates out of our psychology, has murky borders can't quite be um, captured in any kind of set of analytical propositions, but nevertheless represents an important sphere of our experience. It's that second that I recommend to join, not the morality as a set of principles. But if you are in the morality as a set of principles bucket, then there are really two ways to go um, when you think of politics. And there are the two traditions. One tradition says you just apply moral principles to the sphere of the political. And what makes these principles political is just that they're moral principles applied to the sphere of the political. Um, Another approach says no, what's right and wrong in politics is partly about the ethical, um, in whatever shape. It doesn't have to be ethical principles, can be something else, but it's about being ethically guided in part, but it's also in part about being guided by explicitly political considerations. These are considerations to do with power. These are considerations to do with efficacious transformation, an account of agency that I always talk about, to do with who is going to do what and how and when and by what mechanisms. And so, um, if you like, um, one tradition says you work out the political in terms of the moral, the other says the moral is part of the political, but a lot of political questions are worked out internally via further and other political and not necessarily moral considerations. Um, Imagine that you are an anarchist. An anarchist would come along and say, there's something very wrong with the very idea of the state. You guys argue left and right and up and down. You're all wrong. There's something inherently oppressive about the state. It doesn't allow human self-realization under any cultural circumstances. Go screw yourselves. Um, if you think of politics as applied morality, you're going to be tempted to say, well, anarchism is a set of moral principles about what the good life is in society, and we can just go on and apply it to the political. Somebody politically minded would say, possibly, no, I don't think anarchism is a bad political position or a good political position. It's not a political position at all, because it starts by abstracting away the very things in our mode of political life that we are inevitably stuck with, either inevitably stuck with because all humans are stuck with them, some kind of a centralized political authority, or if they're not, then we certainly, under these circumstances, are stuck with this. Right? We're stuck with something like the state in its current form for the foreseeable future. So when you say, this is my political request as an anarchist, but of course realizing would mean bringing about a world in which the state doesn't exist. Well, the objection to that wouldn't be ethical; it would just be political, and it would be that you're not even making a political claim of any kind. You're saying something ethical. You're trying to sellotape it to politics, but it has no purchase. Um, Now, somebody who is an anarchist will not just stop, they'll make improved arguments in response. And as is appropriate, the conversation would continue. But that's an example of explicitly political considerations, right, that have conditioned the way we think about what is a reasonable claim to make, without us saying anything ethical at all. We haven't said that life under anarchism is a bad way for human beings to be, and so on. Um, A way we very commonly in our culture encounter this distinction between moral and political disagreements is when we distinguish between um, expressive and effective politics. Ugly and constructive politics can be effective, ugly and constructive politics can be expressive. I'm not saying expressive politics is wrong. Um, but when the Russian opposition says that they want to join the civilized world and it's time for Russia to join the civilized world, they're not engaging in politics. They're making moralized or even aesthetic claims about the world. What does it mean to join the civilized world? What's your model? What traction does that model have with what's possible in Russia? How could that change begin to happen in Russia? It's a depoliticized predicament. I'm not saying all of them are like that, most of them are. When Ukrainians who love to take the piss out of the Russian opposition say, well, look at the Russian opposition. You know, Mr. Navalny, the late Mr. Navalny, made all kinds of jokes that seem unlovely to us about Crimea not being a sandwich that you can pass back and forth. So surely now it means the Russian opposition are no better than Putin. Well, that's the same kind of activity as the activity of the Russian opposition. It's equally depoliticized. A political response there would say, well, hang on, there is this guy, Navalny, he's now uh, passed, his organization still exists. Is his organization a political vehicle of which we can, to some degree, make use for our purposes? The answer could be no, then you ignore it, or even squabble with it or compete with it somehow. Um, or you say yes, and then you think about how. Whether you like that organization, whether you like any of the people there, whether you think some of them have an imperialist psychological disposition or not, doesn't matter if you're being political about it, right? So the Russian opposition wanting to join the civilized world, there is no politics in that. Ukrainian activists who attack the Russian opposition for the sandwich comment or for something else, no politics in that. That's pure depoliticization. These are moral or aesthetic utterances that you know, usually are not um, they're examples of discourse that occurs in the political sphere, but they don't move anything political. They are aesthetic and moral participations. Often they're consumerist commercial participations. These are things that are said to boost likes. If you were to generalize completely, you would say that what you want is a situation where ethics is richly part of political decision making, but it doesn't exhaustively constrain it. So it's a disaster if ethics has simply fallen by the wayside in political decision making, but it's also a disaster if um, ethics simply constrains politics, because then politics just wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to constructively attend to everything you need to attend to in terms of power, in terms of transformation, in terms of agency, in terms of extremely constrained and complex kinds of choice, and so on. So that's the political uh, uh, 2 cents. The philosophical 2 cents is that uh, political philosophy is not applied moral philosophy. Um, I will be saying a lot more about that because it's a hugely important subject. My hero, Isaiah Berlin, actually very much went on as though ethics weren't just something you could apply to politics. But unfortunately, in one of his essays, he said that ethics is that political philosophy is ethics applied to the realm of the political, and that was embarrassing for Isaiah to say because it contradicted his own commitments. Vlad, what do you think of the revisionist history around Reagan? And how do you think Trump will be seen as an iconic or heroic figure historically? I'm not sure I can comment on the revisionist history of Reagan. Um, I think that Trump will be seen very badly as long as you allow for the fact that, to some degree, victors shape narratives. So um, there will be a lot of people who view Trump positively when he's no longer around. Um, but would responsible professional historians ever view Trump positively? No, that's completely impossible. Leonsky, recently you said that Trump could be imminently victimized by counter-majoritarian institutions. Um, this seems nonsensical to me. What I said was that Putin thought that Trump was being victimized by counter-majoritarian institutions because Trump was constrained by them the way a dictator isn't. Now, Trump is engaged in an all-out assault on counter-majoritarian institutions all over the place, from media to law firms. Um, but Trump is enormously constrained still compared to Lukashenko. So these are matters of degree. Can you talk about selfishness and self-interest and the limits of that in terms of being a good person politically, Vlad? I think you have to be realistic about how much goodwill there is in the world. I think that a lot of goodwill is conditional on not doing something that's actually going to go against your interests. In other words, imagine you took fairly well off parents who are about to send their kid to an expensive university. Imagine you told them, look, there are people in very special kind of need who could be transformed by that money in your country or outside. Depends on how we want to construct the example. Um, don't spend 70,000 on your kid going to uni. Let them go to a very budget higher education institution where they're going to get 70% of the same quality of education, maybe not the same networking possibilities, but they'll still get a decent education, just not a very good one. And you send that money to somebody else. Well, how many parents are going to agree to do that? It's certainly going to be less than 5%. So it's important to understand that there are limits to goodwill in the world, and typically they come in when your own interests are involved. And that's why in friendships, in close relationships, we so much love generosity, love reckless generosity. When somebody does something for us that actually makes a bit of a mess in their life, but they still do it because they love us. The other thing I distinguish is that there needs to be a separate conversation, which we won't have now, about the coherence of the distinction between selfish and selfless behavior. What am I doing now? I'm helping you negotiate the political world. I'm doing it in a way that keeps getting better. I'm getting better at this. But I'm doing my best to help you. Am I behaving selflessly or selfishly? Because I'm also enormously fulfilled by doing this. I consider this a very delightful, privileged hat to wear, very, very minor public intellectual hat. And I love it. And I love getting better at it. And I love, as it were, failing you less as my community. So is my behavior selfish or selfless? Now, you could say that my behavior is certainly not self obsessed. I am not engaging with you in a way that's maximally designed to boost my views, for example. Um, but as soon as we properly ask the question about my motivation, you're going to see the distinction is going to begin to dissolve. Um, and we'll talk about that. I keep 3 months of dehydrated food for times like this. Um, Zenith, are you responding to our general predicament or something that you've read above? Um, by the way, let me know if there are any preppers among you prepping for a pandemic or for societal collapse. I would think the overwhelming majority of us don't prep. Andrew, thank you. I'm aware of David Graeber's work. Um, I'm not an expert in it. What do I think of anarchism in general? I think that anarchism is a very important European tradition. It's you centrally find in Russia and in France. Don't forget that you find anarchism in Russia. That there's a very rich tradition of anti-authoritarianism in 19th century Russia. Um, I think that in contemporary politics, the anarchist position is a pre-political position. But I think that we can learn an enormous amount via being what we call ideologically beautiful toward anarchism, seeing how much we can take from anarchism, which is quite a bit. Um, I have two people in my life who've written books about anarchism. So um, it's not something I'm dismissive about. I mean, in other words, complete ignorance of it would be complete ignorance of who we are and where we've come from. And often ideologies you can't entirely share can have enormously rich materials for critique. Alexander is asking, as an immigrant, I can't but hate the notion that people want us gone because they feel justified to destroy our lives for utter frivolous reasons. Well, if you're Ukrainian in the West, and it sounds like you might be, let me just say it's very important um, for us, Westerners, to protect Ukrainian folks who are in our country. We saw some absolutely despicable behavior the other day. Some of you have asked me to do a reaction to it. I'm not sure I will. By a Russian tool, a citizen of Latvia, um, who racially attacked and physically intimidated a Ukrainian couple on a train in Switzerland. So it's important that we're very protective of the Ukrainians who are in our country. As far as Western citizens and immigration and that their sentiments about immigration, as far as that goes, it's very important that we re-center that debate from a language of rights to a language of the gift, to a language of the gift of welcoming somebody into your home. That actually mitigates resentment to some degree. But you've got to understand that nobody in the end just has a flat right that's going to be civically accepted to enter another country. There's got to be some notion of a door. The difference is that we want to make that door welcoming, and we want to make that door as minimally cruel and fascicized as possible. Ben, most professional political commentators don't criticize the objective political problems, but rather rhetorical issues. How can the public hold them to account? Um, they can't, except by doing some of what we're doing. I mean, this kind of low level underground work whereby we are gathered together to engage in a little bit of constructive political discourse. Um, the only other thing is that you've got to have some kind of democratic oversight of how large media companies operate. I'd still challenge you a bit. I do think that there's quite a lot of work that big media organizations do that's really high quality, including the BBC, including the New York Times. What we should appreciate is that that's not inconsistent with these same organizations doing a lot of silly stuff or a lot of bad stuff. But we don't want to be blind to the good stuff because bad stuff is generated by the same organization. The truth is that 66.3% of our political discourse is entertainment. And that's a problem. It's a real problem because entertainment is thin, entertainment is superficial, entertainment is not transformational. How often do you consume political content in our culture and go away feeling transformed by it? Not enough. I'm feeling very negative about the future of humanity. Limitless Limited is saying. Um, Russia's aims in Ukraine are still maximalist. US power is waning. China is rising. Taiwan is in trouble. What hope is there? Well, there's a lot of hope. Um, Virtually no Western society, probably no Western society, will experience societal collapse in the coming decades. All of us, except those of us who are physically disabled, will be able to go to the theater and will be able to go to the bar. Um, Moreover, we stand a very strong chance of keeping our democracies. This is a blueprint question from a perception of um, all of our historical inheritance. The trouble that we're in is minor to moderate. From a perception of our recent historical experience, the trouble we're in is major, and alarm bells are ringing. Eventually, you're going to have to explore your blueprint and what blueprint best fits your character and how you negotiate the political world in the 2020s and the 2030s. It may need to change because you're going to put too much pressure on yourself if your blueprint is persecutory. Um, Many people in this room have a persecutory blueprint of how the world is meant to go. It's a blueprint that does internal violence to you by being a bit historically out of date. This is something that most citizens who have it won't change for another 5 to 10 years, but it's a problem. And it's important to, at the same time, having said this firmly, to be very gentle and very patient with us around this. You can't wake up and change your blueprint tomorrow. You're not going to be doing yourself any good if you wake up and you do incantations about how you're actually okay with the political world. You're not okay with the political world. Melinda, lovely to see you. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for your support. Why do far left regimes like Russia, North Korea, and Israel transition into far right over time? I'm not sure that's a good sociology of these regimes, for any of them, in fact. Um, Russia didn't transition from left to right. Russia had a regime collapse, regime disintegration, and eventually a very different kind of regime formed. Um, I don't know how what you say captures Israel either. North Korea is a very weird, very hybridized kind of story with plenty of hard left and hard right elements over time. Vlad, answer my question about the Russian opposition. Fish says thanks. Okay, let me scroll up. Vlad's voice is essential. Melinda, I'm so grateful. Don't see your question about the Russian opposition because I'm blind and I can't look properly. Oh, got you. Do you think it's correct of the Russian opposition to focus on corruption in the military, which results in the military apparatus being more efficient? It's a red herring. You got to throw um, uh, your weight everywhere if you're the Russian opposition and politicize everything. Politicizing the military means here are the 15 principles we have along which we're going to run the military. I don't see that from anyone in the Russian opposition. So what they're after is politicization there. What they do now will have no effect in practice at all. It will make the Russian military no less, no more efficient, whatever they say. Um, but could it conceivably be part of a project which just says, "Look, guys, this regime is utterly incompetent"? Well, yeah, yes, it could, because as you saw under Prigozhin, that kind of critique worked. It's just that there was nothing else that Prigozhin was offering except critique. Um, so, what the Russian opposition need to be doing is um, politicizing, um, getting Russian citizens to question, getting Russian citizens to, you know, perceive things out of the box in which they're stuck. Um, and that's why the question becomes a sort of red herring. If I could afford to establish a sustainable commune and the seed bank, I would. Well, you never know. I mean, often these places are very, very unconstructive too. I lived for a while on a very small island in northern Tonga. I spent time on very small islands, and one had a population of one actually. But I spent time on an island with a population of about 4 or 5,000 people. And there were some smaller islands around, and perhaps all in all, we totaled 10,000 people. And then the nearest next population center was 18 hours by ferry, 18 to 27 hours by ferry away, depending on how slow or fast the ferry was, or an hour by flight. Well, there were lots of locals there, but also there was a kind of concentration of Westerners there, a small number of Westerners, perhaps 50. Some of them were transitory, like US Peace Corps, but others were just permanently there, and they formed a kind of community with a lot of self sufficiency there, too. You fished for your own food and so on. Well, it attracted some of the biggest weirdos with significant mental health challenges from all over the world. It was it was filmable by Werner Herzog. So that's also part of how this thing can go. Yeah, that guy on the train was absolutely repulsive. Um, and it's very important that we don't essentialize cultures, but it doesn't mean we can't judge cultures. And the thing he demonstrated is a kind of unboundariness. And I'm afraid to say that That is probably the central pathology in Russian culture. It doesn't mean that all or even most Russians are unboundaried. It just means that there's a bigger problem with unboundariness in Russian culture than there is in uh, the neighboring countries, Russia's neighboring countries, and even other ex-Soviet countries. And that guy was an absolute sort of intensification of this cultural pathology that is generally problematic, generally present. I get stressed by double standards in politics, Mr. Tough Guy. Um, Double standards in politics are a problem, but sometimes hypocrisy is also a virtue in politics. It's often better to defend certain principles hypocritically than not to defend them at all. It's better that some people hypocritically stand up for free speech than if nobody stands for free speech. So, in a realistic political environment, I'm afraid hypocrisy is as much a virtue as it is a vice. Daphne, thank you back. Let's go a little bit longer. Limitless Limited, thank you for saying I'm wonderful. No, witness me. Democratic decline is not an inherent problem of democracy. Very often, we're tempted to use very universal materials to explain what happens under culture. But very often, what happens under culture is to be explained by things that are specific to particular historical formations. So I don't think we can articulate what's wrong with our democracies by discussing general paradoxes of democracy, though some of them are interesting. I'm not sure responsible hypocrisy is a term we want, Kristen, but I think that you can't do without hypocrisy, and there is such a thing as being hypocritical, but also ethically adequate at the same time. Certainly, a modicum of hypocrisy is ineliminably part of operating with in high political power. The Zig. Um, what about the question that our political drive is unsuited to satisfying our need for a good life? I don't think that our political drive is one central drive. Political activity is a kind of human activity that you could generalize about and say it's one thing among others that humans do, but it's not because we are driven to do it. It's because when you combine um, human motivation with the challenges of collective coexistence, political questions arise, political challenges arise, political decisions need to be made. You know, A conflicts with B. What are we going to do? Who's right? Who's wrong? Who's going to be prioritized? So, um, politics is age old, right? Because we can't but be blasted into politics by the simplest materials of social life. Um, Now, the greatest text in the history of the West discussing um, the relation of the life of participation in politics and the life of the mind is, of course, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is one of the five greatest, probably, individual texts in moral philosophy. I think that um, there are plenty of ways of um, doing politics in a way that's conducive to leading a good life. I don't see how you could deny that. Um, there's also the fact that all kinds of um, pathologies get dramatized when they are transferred into the political realm, especially in a society where politics is not going very well. Do you observe the post-truth world to be apolitical, not relegated to just one political side? So apolitical typically means um, not having enough friction with the materials of politics, being pre-political or post-political. That's not what the word we typically use when we talk about something being politically neutral or being present across the political spectrum. Um, yes, post-truth is basically behavior whereby you're not denying particular truths, but you're denying the stability of the distinction between truth and lies in general. Anybody could do that, but under particular cultural circumstances, it would be um, uh, more likely that particular sides in particular bits in our political landscape are more guilty of it than others, right? So obviously Trump is a master of this. Would you ever do a talk about the Nicomachean ethics on the philosophy channel? Yes, sure. I can do a talk about what it might mean to be a modern Aristotelian. The Nicomachean Ethics is one of the philosophical texts which in some ways I can sort of walk around the way you walk around a house you're familiar with, but I'm not an Aristotle expert. So there would need to be this caveat. Which are the other four great texts of moral philosophy? The greatest texts are um, the greatest contributors are Aristotle, Kant, obviously Plato, Aristotle, Plato, Kant, Hume, and Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the last of the world historically great contributors to moral philosophy. With some of these, you could pick a book or two, like perhaps with Aristotle. With others, like Plato and Nietzsche, you couldn't. You would have to attend to the entire corpus of their writings. So conceivably, you could say that Nietzsche and Plato are. Plato's a much greater philosopher than Nietzsche, but Nietzsche and Plato are the only two philosophers in the history of the West who wrote great works of moral philosophy repeatedly. Hume is a wonderful philosopher to read because there are many great philosophers like Kant who's not difficult, who's not easy to read. If you want to read Plato, um, I'd suggest, depending how deeply you want to jump into it, I'd suggest being guided by Miles Bernier, who passed away a few years ago. Was my number one classical philosophy source. Is Stoicism the best philosophy for living under a dictatorship? No. Um, Stoicism is two things. It's a tradition in the West. It's also a chimp-like bunch of self-development slogans that bros who talk about being an entrepreneur and go to the gym use, mess around with. So don't believe straight away everything you hear about Stoicism. I will do a talk about what might be wrong with Stoicism as a philosophy that you use to guide your life, um, uh, on the philosophy channel. But roughly, no, it's not a good guide for living your best life under a dictatorship. When you lose something, a footnote on the Stoicism question, it's even worse and actually not better if you have lost the sense of loss. The loss of the sense of loss is a secondary loss on top of the loss. We don't want human beings and citizens who've lost a sense of what they've lost. If you've lost something, it's actually better to be in a complex relationship, perhaps in a relationship of grief with that thing. You still remain connected to it. I'm sure we will talk about Karl Popper. I think that um, there are two ways to get into philosophy or political philosophy. One is as a professional, one is as an amateur. As a professional, these days, you very probably need a PhD, although you could publish without a PhD, might not be able to teach. But the way you non-professionally get into political philosophy is by reading people who introduce you to it in a very responsible way. Could be um, Alan Ryan, one of my teachers at Oxford, was absolutely wonderful. John Donne. So let's little by little begin winding ourselves down because we've given it a go. We've had a good conversation. Let me just make a tiny last remark before I let you go, and that's just to welcome Amalfitano to our community. Amalfitano, who you all know, who is not actually a member of the community who is supportive, but has been in an extraordinary way working with me as sort of executive director of my minor public intellectual project. She's quite remarkable. She's got an amazing professional background. She's disabled. and has gone through extraordinary health challenges in the last few years. And um, in a way, I have myself been too sick to properly take advantage of this uh, cooperation we're doing. Um, uh, because, as you know, to uh, sort of expand one's wings requires a kind of wherewithal, which then requires you having more health in turn. So, but we're exploring where this can go, and I want to welcome Amalfitano more formally to the community, and the label we have got for our corporation is that she is the executive director of whatever it is that we're going and trying to do here. So everybody, thank you. Amalfitano, thank you so much for being with us. I'll talk a little bit more about Amalfitano in the future too. Um, so I'm grateful to everybody for having patience with me and doing this more personal Q&A. Lots and lots of love, and talk very, very soon.